Thank you, Al, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming and giving up some of your time on a beautiful day. I was reminiscing with my good friend Bill Affleck here about an incident that happened years ago involving a waitress. And I won't tell you that story, but I'll tell you a story about a waitress. An older couple came into a restaurant, and the waitress sat them down, and she said to the woman, "What can I get for you, ma'am?" And well, she said, "Well, I'd like the roast beef dinner and mashed potatoes and a salad and a Pepsi Cola." And she said, "And your vegetable?" And she said, "He'll have the same." I think it was that same waitress, and I think she was a blonde, and I hope I'm not going to hurt anybody's feelings here, who might be a blonde, but the blonde went into a library, and she said, walked right up to the desk and said, "I'd like a hamburger, French fries, and a Coke." And the lady who worked in the library said, "Ma'am, this is a library." "Oh," she says, "I'd like a hamburger." Well, ladies and gentlemen, we got some serious matters to talk about here. Talk about the Constitutional Convention and the possibility of there being one. Let's start off by saying that preserving the Constitution has to be #1 item for all of us. We can get excited about Common Core, we can get excited about this, about that, or about something else, but if we lose the Constitution, then we don't have any standard to measure them by. So I want you to realize that this is an extremely important topic. And if it's not #1 on your agenda, I want you to make it that. We've got to stop the Constitutional Convention, because if they get their hands on it, we won't recognize it when we get it back. So we're going to put it under a microscope here. We have in our country today a tremendous population of people who have lost awareness, or maybe even never had awareness, of a very fundamental point, and that is that America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. Now, if that awareness could come back, then there would be a lot more people on our side, there would be a lot more people involved in protecting the Constitution, and so on. Over the course of the years, there have been a lot of people comment about the U.S. Constitution, and some of them praised it to the skies, I guess you could say. William Gladstone was the Prime Minister of England in the 1860s. I'm not partial to the British, but at least every once in a while somebody over there says something right? Gladstone said, "It's the greatest piece of work ever struck off at any given time by the brain and purpose of man." He couldn't say it, and he couldn't praise it more highly. And about the same time, when Canada was becoming a government more similar to what is happening in Britain, their first Prime Minister was a man named John MacDonald, and he looked it over and he said, "I think and believe it is one of the most perfect organizations that ever governed a free people." Now, the gist of the Constitution is not what government's powers are. The gist of it is what government's powers are not, which are not government's powers. And that, of course, is what we said on the previous slide. The value of the Constitution, there are many ways you can look into it, but you have to start off by saying it's a standard by which to measure the performance of elected officials. Now, our New American Magazine publishes periodically, twice a year, a Freedom Index where we rate congressmen and senators as to whether or not they stood by the Constitution. I think that probably a lot of you are aware about the upset down in Virginia, where the #2 Republican leader in the House was beaten by a guy who was an unknown, who was using the Freedom Index in his campaign to show that the supposed conservative named Eric Cantor was not really standing by the Constitution. So that's a value that we have there, that's a standard to measure them. And the Constitution is a grant of limited power to the nation's federal government. And then it's a restrainer of government's always voracious power grabbing. Now it's restrained by the fact that a lot of powers are not granted, but it's also restrained by the 9th and 10th Amendments, especially the 10th. That says if we didn't give you any power, you can't take it. It belongs to the people, belongs to the states. Okay? So the Constitution is extreme. Now, all of these congressmen and senators, they all take an oath. Not only them, but the president and then the heads of the different departments. And even in the military, it's not the same oath that you take in the military, but it's similar. You stand by the Constitution. I'm reminded of a Birch fellow I know up in the state of Montana who in speaking to people would mention the fact that sometimes people say, well, our congressman's pretty good. He gets to 70% on your rating, your Freedom Index rating. And the man's response was, he said, you know, I got married and that was kind of a contract between me and my wife. And if I came home and told her that I obeyed that contract 70% of the time, how long do you think I'd still be married? Well, we ought to consider it the same. So, the value of the Constitution, it can't be overstated. Now, my favorite part of the Constitution is Article 1, Section 1, Sentence 1, right after the preamble. It says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. Therefore, there's no lawmaking power by presidential executive orders. There's no lawmaking power by Supreme Court decisions, both of which we are getting all the time. Executive order is proper if it's addressed to the people who work in the executive branch of government. You've got to consider the president like the CEO of a corporation. He could say to his employees, you can't do this, you can do this, and he's got a perfect right to do that. He's the head of the corporation. But suppose he started saying, well, every other corporation has to do it the way I do it. They'd all say, buzz off, you know. No way. Right? Well, the President of the United States is like the CEO of a corporation. And he can extend executive orders to the employees, as George Washington did when he said that all federal employees shall have a paid holiday on the 25th of December to celebrate the birth of the Lord. But he didn't say it was nationwide. That was for other people to decide in their bailiwicks. So an executive order is proper if it stays in the executive branch. If it starts to govern the people of the United States, it's wrong. Now, you go to most people in our country today and you ask them, what is the role of the Supreme Court? Invariably, they will tell you is to interpret the Constitution, which is dead wrong. It is not to interpret the Constitution, it's to obey the Constitution and to make sure others do as well. So when you hear anybody say, interpret the Constitution, shake your head, say, no, you got that wrong. Right? And you got to do it in a nice way, you don't want to make an enemy. All right? What are abuses and dereliction of duty that we see all the time? Well, the war power is given to Congress. We haven't used that war power since December 8th of 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. We didn't use it in Korea, we didn't use it in Vietnam, we didn't use it in Bosnia, we didn't use it in Iraq, we didn't use it in Afghanistan, and so on. And what's interesting is we haven't won any of the wars since World War II. No declaration of war, no goal, and no win. The Constitution has authorization for Congress to coin money, not to issue money. There's a big difference there. The Coinage Act of 1792 allowed the federal government to set up a mint, take the people's gold, silver, and whatever else they wanted, smashed into coinage of a fixed size, weight, and purity, and so forth. And that was the job of the federal government, granted by the Constitution. Congress shall have the power to coin money. It never gave Congress the power to issue money, nor did it give it to any other branch, nor to any private agency like the Federal Reserve. Is the Constitution being adhered to? Well, Constitution says it's the duty of the federal government to protect the states from invasion. You got somewhere between 11 and 30 million people who walked across the border into our country from Mexico. Is that not an invasion?
Yes.
If it isn't, I don't know what the word means. And whose job is that to protect the borders? Federal government. Dereliction of duty? Absolutely. And failure to abide by the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment, I always like to say all those in the Bill of Rights, Congress shall not, all the way up to the 10th Amendment that says, if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. Right? Ignoring the Constitution. Here's a classic example. On October 3rd of 2002, this was 6 months before the second invasion of Iraq. The first one was in 1991. They called it Desert Storm. So 6 months before the second invasion, the House International Relations Committee met to discuss planning for a war already being undertaken by the George W. Bush administration. They were already planning to do this. Right? So all 45 committee members were there, as well as others in the Congress. They had all sworn an oath to abide by the Constitution. Congressman Ron Paul, member of the committee, he stood up and he said, "Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. I move that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war." Good for you, Ron Paul. So what happened? Well, the chairman of the committee was a so-called conservative from Chicago named Henry Hyde. And he said, "Ron, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. Your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic, it isn't done anymore." He actually said that. So then they had the vote in the committee, 45 members, and the vote was 45 to no to do away with Ron Paul's motion. And he voted against himself, as he said he would. Now, you wonder if a congressman would consider that portion of the Constitution that says he shall be paid for his services. You wonder if he'll consider that an anachronism as well. And you know what the answer is to that. Right? So, the Iraq War came, killed 4,400, wounded 10 times more, and it looks like we may be even going back.
Yeah.
Right? After 9 years. Making law via executive orders. Bill Clinton had an aide who actually worked in the White House named Paul Begala, one of his buddies from, I've forgotten where. And he actually said at one time when he was talking about executive orders, he said, "Stroke of the pen, law of the land, kind of cool." And he kind of laughed about the fact that they were making law just by the stroke of a pen. Right? The American people allowed that to happen. It continues to happen. Barack Obama, when he was running, America does not, no, this isn't when he was running, just recently, America does not stand still, and neither will I. So wherever, whenever I can take steps without legislation, and those are his words, to expand opportunity for more Americans, that's what I'm going to do. That was his State of the Union speech in January. So he believes in the use of executive orders. He's already passed executive orders to, in the environmental arena and in now raising the minimum wage for some people, and then maybe more coming, right? So, facing all of this, we see these abuses going on, and now we see people want to improve the Constitution. What they really want to do is open it up for a complete overhaul. Now, that's not everybody. There are some people who are frustrated by the amount of government, the taxation, the cost, the regulations, and so forth. And they say, we got to do something. So they look for a quick fix, and the quick fix is, let's have a constitutional convention and we'll bind the government down, as if they would obey an amendment when they haven't obeyed the Constitution in the first place. So they call for a constitutional convention. But the Constitution isn't at fault, and it doesn't need amending. It might be a good idea to amend it and get rid of Amendments 16 and 17, but that's something else. Right? 16 and 17 with the income tax and the direct election of senators. Those are the only amendments I want to see. And that can be done because there was an amendment one time to the Constitution outlawing the use of alcohol. Right? And a few years later, the Irish took over, and they had it amended so that now you could use alcohol. And the Irish had a few friends in that. Right? The Constitution isn't at fault. Would amending the 10 Commandments stop people from stealing and lying and murdering? No. Defects in government are the work of leaders who don't obey their oath to abide by the Constitution's restrictions. So the problem isn't the Constitution, it's the people who are running the government, and it's the American populace that is allowing that to happen. So the Constitution actually has a provision to allow for amendments. And there's two ways of amending the Constitution. The first procedure is 2/3 in both houses of Congress agree to propose amendments. All such amendments must then be ratified if they're passed at Congress by 3/4 of the states. And this is the process that has resulted in adding 27 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Now, the Constitution was finally put in place, was voted on and approved in 1789, and the government started, our federal government started operations in 1791 with George Washington at the helm. And we've been going downhill ever since. Oh, no, who said that? So, 27 amendments in how many years? 230? Close to it, anyhow. Which says it's a pretty good document in the first place, doesn't it? But of the 27 amendments, the first of the Bill of Rights, that's the first 10, and I consider that part of the original Constitution because it wouldn't have been ratified if the promise hadn't been made to add to it a Bill of Rights. And so I consider that, so we're down to 17 amendments to the Constitution. And then we have prohibition and no prohibition. That takes 2 out, so now we're down to 15. So we have 15 amendments in 230 years, which speaks well of the wisdom that put it together in the first place. The other procedure for amending the Constitution is if 2/3 of the states petition Congress to create a constitutional convention. Now, all amendments coming out of a constitutional convention must be ratified by 3/4 of the states. That's what the Constitution says. If the convention hasn't altered or abolished the process. In other words, you could require 3/4 of the states to pass something that comes out of a constitutional convention, but before you got to that step, the Constitutional Convention could have abolished the ratification by the states, which is what happened with the Articles of Confederation. In 1787, Con-Con, the only Con-Con ever in the history of our country, was put together to alter and improve the Articles of Confederation, which is the government system we fought the War for Independence with. Right? That called for unanimous approval of the states if there's going to be an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. But that Constitutional Convention canceled the Articles, just did away with them completely, and changed the requirement from unanimous approval of the states to only 3/4 of the states needed for approving any new constitution and adding any amendments to it. You see, a constitutional convention is unlimited. It is the boss. Once it is in power, it is the boss. It can wipe the slate clean. It can do whatever it wants. And you've got to believe that there are some people promoting this constitutional convention that want to do away what we have in the Constitution to begin with. Right? Now, there are a lot of myths going around about whether or not we should have a constitutional convention. Some of the proponents claim falsely that it's a convention of the states and it's not a constitutional convention. That's just word playing around with, right? A convention of the states is a constitutional convention. They say that the states can control a con-con once it's in power. No, they can't. And the example for that is what happened in 1787. They say a con-con can be limited. No, it can't. A con-con is a sovereign entity. It can do what it wants. They say the state ratification process will bar mischief. No, the state ratification process can be abolished. And there wouldn't be any need for states to ratify it. A con-con can't change the whole Constitution, people tell us. And the answer to that is, you got that wrong. It can change the whole Constitution. So there are questions then. I like to pose these questions to somebody who's in favor of a con-con. How are you going to choose the delegates? How many delegates per state? Will you have it the same as the way in Congress, the way the Electoral College works? You got a state like Delaware, has 1 congressman, 2 senators, therefore 3 electoral votes. You go out to California, they have 2 senators and 54 members of the House, so they have 56 votes. Is that the way you're going to have it in the Constitutional Convention? Or you're just going to have so many votes per state, every state the same, or whatever? And who decides this? Who's the expenses? Who's going to pay people to go to the Constitutional Convention and house them and set up the cocktail parties and whatever else they do? Where are you going to hold the Constitutional Convention? There are some people who say, well, Hawaii's nice, especially if it's in the wintertime. Right? Who's going to guarantee the safety of the delegates? Is it going to be federal marshals? Is it going to be the state police? Is it going to be the 82nd Airborne or the U.S. Marine Corps or what? Right? So there's a lot of questions. People don't want to talk about this. They just want to have a con-con. Right? Well, the answer to those questions is, go back to Article 5, and you see that the Congress has the power to call a convention for proposing amendments. Right? Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants power to Congress to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers in Section 8 of the Constitution, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. So the question is answered. The Congress of the United States shall decide all of those questions. Right? You want to put it in the hands of Nancy Pelosi? John Boehner? Well, you won't put it in the hands of Eric Cantor anymore, that's for sure. So, the questions have been answered. The questions would be answered. Now, I'm not advocating that the Congress go ahead and answer all those questions on the way to a con-con. I'm just saying that the procedures are there. In other words, people who wrote the Constitution covered all the bases, or almost all of the bases. They knew what they were doing. That's why there was such praise, even from outside our country, for the Constitution. Now, who favors a Constitution? Most of the ordinary people in our country who favor a constitutional convention do so because they want a quick fix. Right? They're frustrated. They see government costs, they see government manipulation, they see government regulations. They say, somebody got to do something. And they're set up for a quick fix, a constitutional convention. And that's too bad. But you know, all of you can talk them out of it with some good sense. Now, who else favors it? Well, there's this Mark Levin, a radio talk show guy. I personally can't stand listening to him. He's so coarse and so forth. And he wrote a book called The Liberty Amendments, and he's proposed 11 different amendments to the Constitution. One or two of which I agree with, the rest no. Right? He does want to do away with the 16th and the 17th Amendments. That's good. But then you got Limbaugh and Hannity and Beck, and they're quick fix artists and quick fix leaders of the quick fix brigade. There's the National Tax Limitation Committee. They want a con-con. The National Taxpayers Union. The Goldwater Institute. I had an occasion early in this battle, as it got ramped up again, I called down to the Goldwater Institute and asked to speak to Barry Goldwater Jr., the son of the famous senator. I had met him a couple of times. I introduced myself. Oh, how are you doing? I'm doing fine. He said, I got a question for you. I said, I know the Goldwater Institute has come out in favor of a constitutional convention. Are you in favor of it yourself? He said, absolutely. I said, well, I guess the conversation's over then. I'm not going to be able to talk you out of it, am I? He says, no, you're not. I said, okay, thanks. See you down the road. Michael Farris of the Patrick Henry College, right? He's given up the leadership of the college now, and he's a fellow who got involved in protecting homeschool advocates. So he has some credentials among the people who are on the correct side of a lot of issues. But look into that, and it's really not as bright a picture as you might expect. The Tea Party Patriots are in favor of the fellow named Mark Meckler was the leader of that, and he stepped aside now, and I got challenged about that by saying the Tea Party Patriots isn't in favor of it. I said, well, Meckler was, and he was the head of the Tea Party. That's true, but not the Tea Party itself. All right, okay. There's a group called Wolfpack, a bunch of left-wingers. And then George Soros. George Soros is the financier of everything that goes wrong. Right? More leftists, the Young Turks. Harvard University's Lawrence Lessig. He's a very important man in this whole thing. And he just came back from the Bilderberg conference over in Copenhagen. Alliance for Democracy, Code Pink, Independent Progressive Network, Progressive Democrats of America. So you see the so-called conservatives, the Limbaughs, the Hannitys, the Levins, and so forth. And then you see Progressive Democrats and Independent Democrats and the Sierra Club and then Vermont for single payer. Right? Poor Vermont, right? Right? Somebody ought to do something about Vermont. All right, now opponents of a con-con. There are a lot of them too. We start off with James Madison. James Madison, rightly called the father of the Constitution. Right? And Thomas Jefferson. Right? And Phyllis Schlafly of Eagle Forum. She's been very outspoken on this, on the correct side. Edwin Vieira, a constitutional attorney. Guy is just absolutely brilliant. Tom DeWeese of the American Policy Center. Former Justice Warren Burger. Former Justice Arthur Goldberg. The late Judge Robert Bork. Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard, Charles Rice of Notre Dame, Gerald Gunther of Stanford, and the John Birch Society. Right? Right. These are opponents of a con-con. So there's a battle going on. More opponents of the con-con. This is surprising in some ways. The ACLU is opposed to a con-con. Right? The American Federation of Teachers is. They're pretty left-wing, both of them. Americans for Democratic Action, they're opposed to it. Not that outspoken about it, but they have registered as an opponent. Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the NAACP, National Organization for Women, People for the American Way. All of these groups worry that the Bill of Rights might be canceled. Excuse me, let us get a sip of water here. So their reason for opposing a constitution is good if it does say that the Bill of Rights might be canceled. But they don't get into it as deeply as we do. Former Chief Justice Warren Burger wrote a letter. The letter's been made public. He said that participants in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, that was to revise the articles as we do, had no authority to write a constitution. They were authorized only to revise. Got to Philadelphia, they paid no attention to those limits and wisely threw the whole thing away and wrote the Constitution. Right? Now, he didn't say it in so many words, but he's confirming the attitude that I've already given that said a constitutional convention cannot be limited. It is a sovereign entity. It could abolish everything, start all over again, as was done. And Berger is saying that that's what happened in 1787, and he's correct. Justice Berger wasn't opposed to amendments, but he expressed his strong opposition to a constitutional convention that would have the power to void the entire Constitution. Okay, I said I wanted good amendments. What would be good amendments? Well, if we could amend the Constitution to repeal Amendment 16, we could do away with the federal income tax. If we could amend the Constitution to repeal Amendment 17, that would be the direct election of senators mandated, then we would go back to the states appointing the senators to be the advocate for states' rights within the federal government, not to have two parties, two houses of Congress doing virtually the same thing. It would be nice. The Founding Fathers wanted an advocate of state power in the federal government, and that was the Senate's job. And that was done away with in 1913. 1913 turned out to be a very, very pivotal year in the history of our country. We got the income tax, we got the direct election of senators, and we got the Federal Reserve. And I can remember in the year 2000, I wrote one of my columns, and I started it off by saying 77 years ago, which was 1913, this is what happened to America. Right? Now, a lot of the people who want a convention, constitutional convention, want it because they want to balance the budget. The budget's out. Look, we're spending over $1 trillion every year, almost $2 trillion every year. We're running it up. It's almost up to $18 trillion now. Incomprehensible amount of money. We got to do something to stop this, right? So they say, all right, we got to have a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. What are the flaws? Well, expecting government officials to honor an amendment when they don't already honor the Constitution doesn't make any sense, does it? Some balanced budget amendments allow 60% in Congress to override it. So you could have a balanced budget amendment, but if 60% in Congress, then you don't have a balanced budget amendment. Some call for tax increases if the budget isn't balanced, even steering taxing authority to the executive branch where it doesn't belong. Some say the budget doesn't have to be balanced if there's a war or a national security threat, and a national security threat could be what is happening in Iraq today with militant Arab insurgents now marching on Baghdad again, right? But there are even more flaws. Some say that the balanced budget amendments provisions wouldn't take effect for 5 years, meaning more trillions added to an already enormous debt. Some say the way to get around the deficit problem is to declare some expenditures off budget. So we say, okay, this won't count in the budget, it's off budget, but it's still costing you and me money, still costing us taxation. And balanced budget amendments generally ignore the enormous deficit already accumulated, $17 trillion. So, you know, there are so many holes in these balanced budget amendment proposals, you could drive a Mack truck through them. Right? There are good ways to balance the budget. Congress can cut spending for unconstitutional programs, and Congress can nullify laws and programs. Right? Okay, let's take a look at that. Cut spending. Unused power, Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House. If the House won't originate a bill for foreign aid, education, housing, transportation, medicine, that's it. That's it. There's nothing the Senate, the President, or the Supreme Court can do, or the New York Times. They can't even do anything either. Right? Now, how many people know that? I remember talking to a congressman one time, and I said, well, you got the power of the purse, Article 1, Section 7. And I repeated it, all bills for raising revenue have to originate in the House. And he said to me, is that really in there? I went, oh my God. Oh. So the power of the purse is in the House. That's why we say we take our government back, starting in the House of Representatives. You can get excited about a senator race, you can get excited about who's going to be president, but if you had a decent member in the House of Representatives, and enough of them, they could stop it all and begin to repeal a lot of it. And you don't have to pass a law to repeal the Department of Education, you just have to defund it. Right? Then we wouldn't have to worry about Common Core and Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind. You know that No Child Left Behind program they had? I always said to myself, well, that ought to be applied to the debt. No child is left behind that debt. They're all going to have to pay it. So that's unconstitutional federal programs. Here's a few. Foreign aid, education, housing, energy, medical care, etc. Right? Added authority, Amendment 10. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or the people. In other words, the federal government, you have no authority in this area. Now you can cut spending via the Constitution. No federal expenditures for all of this that we've already mentioned. You've got to remember too that the Constitution is not self-enforcing. Politicians will ignore it if not checked. Judges will ignore it if not reined in. The need is for an alert populace that demands adherence to the document all leaders solemnly swear to honor.
How do we get them to do that?
We get them to join the John Birch Society.
Well, that's true. I want action, not...
Well, that's action.
Well,
Every new member of the John Birch Society is worth reaching 100 people, and sometimes 1,000.
True.
So the answer to your question is number 4 on the chart here. John Birch Society exists to create an alert and well-informed public. Now, let's just contrast the two proposals for amending the Constitution. The first one is to rely on the Constitution itself. And if you're going to have an amendment, you need 218 in the House. You need 51 or more in the Senate. Actually, the House can abolish something just by not funding it. And there's no role for state ratifications. So 218 in the House can, in fact, do what we want done, and that is to stop a lot of these federal programs. If you go to a balanced budget amendment, you need 290 in the House, you need 67 in the Senate, and you need 38 state ratifications. So, isn't garnering of only 218 in the House an easier process than getting 290 in the House, 67 in the Senate, and 38 in the state legislatures? I mean, it just makes all kinds of sense. Also, isn't the First Amendment safer? Right. Well, we already got into this. It's an error to believe that the duty of the Supreme Court and lower federal courts is to interpret the Constitution. Their task is to rule that a measure is or is not constitutional. Most decisions should be. It's none of our federal government's business. We wrongly allow leaders to make a federal case out of virtually everything. And every time I say that, I think of my mother, my late mother. I'd skin my knee, or I'd come in crying because I hurt my elbow or something like that. And she'd bandage me up, and then she'd say to me, don't make a federal case out of it. My mother was not politically acute, but she sure knew what that meant, right? And we make a federal case out of virtually everything, don't we? Which is ridiculous. Beginning in 1988, the John Birch Society and a few allies persuaded some state legislators in 18 states to rescind all previous Constitutional Convention calls. In other words, there were calls on the books. They wanted a convention for this, they wanted a constitutional convention, excuse me, an amendment for flag burning. an amendment prohibiting abortion, an amendment for this, an amendment for that. But we persuaded a lot of these state legislators that this is the wrong way to go. You can do it in a better way. So the different states that went ahead and followed the advice are listed there. And Florida did rescind all, and then it later issued a new balanced budget con-con call when our people in Florida weren't looking. Right? So then there are the leaders of the con-con movement that say, well, once you have called for a constitutional convention, you can't rescind your call. Why not? Right? I don't know if it ever would come to that. It might end up going to the courts, and I can't imagine, even as bad as some of the Supreme Court decisions are, I can't imagine that the Supreme Court wouldn't agree that, yes, you can rescind a constitutional convention call before a constitutional convention gets underway. Now, James Madison, one of the best, fourth president, father of the Constitution, writer of the Federalist Papers, the author of the Bill of Rights, was a member of Congress and an opponent of another con-con. Right? He knew what it was all about. In 1788, he wrote a letter to somebody, and he said, having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, which assembled under very propitious circumstances, I should tremble for the result of a second. What were the propitious circumstances that he saw? George Washington was the leader of the convention, right? That meant an awful lot. Because Washington would walk into the room and everybody would hush, right? And there were people who wanted him to become the king, and he said, no, I don't want to be king. I want the people to govern themselves, right? So Madison was very, very firm about that. He later said it again in essay number 40 in the Federalist Papers. The essays to persuade the farmers in New York State to want the new Constitution. Right? So they explained it in the Federalist Papers. Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. Madison said the authority given to conduct the Philadelphia Convention was limited and was for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. So he confirmed what we've said before. He said that in the Federalist Papers, essay number 40. I have given the Federalist Papers to some college graduate people that I know who have to admit that they can't read it. It's too difficult. Right? You sometimes get a sentence, the whole page, one sentence. Right? These are college graduates today, and it was written for the farmers in New York State in 1788 and 89. Nullification is the other process, right? The other process to roll back government. In 2005, Congress enacted what is called the Real ID Act, right? That would require every American citizen to have a federally issued identification so that they could play like Hitler's Germany, where they would stop people and say, your papers, please, right? Right? Well, there were some states, quite a few of them, that just simply refused to do it. And they effectively nullified it without any legislation. They just refused to do it. And that can be done as well. But nullification is a process that you can go for formally and formally get rid of something that's oppressive. Thomas Jefferson said that a nullification by those sovereignties, states, of all unauthorized acts done under the color of that instrument, the Constitution, is the rightful remedy. Right? Now, notice what he was calling the states. He was calling them sovereignties. Right? Each state was... The wisdom of the Founding Fathers included the fact that the different states would compete with each other to be the best state, to be the one where you want to raise a family, start a business, conduct your affairs, and so forth. And there are still some differences among the states, right? There's one state that has no state sales tax and no state income tax. Only one. Anybody want to guess who?
New Hampshire.
Delaware.
New Hampshire's the answer. Usually people say Alaska. No, not Alaska. New Hampshire. And the movement there in New Hampshire all the time, right in the state legislature. Well, happily, the last time they met, they had 7 members of the Birch Society in the state legislature.
Isn't their motto, live free or die?
Their motto is live free or die, right? I can remember years ago when Governor Mel Thompson was the governor, who was a member of the John Birch Society, by the way, and somebody changed his license plate on his car to live and let live, and he forced the state police to go down and apprehend that and give him a new license plate. You didn't mess around with Mel Thompson, right? Now, he called the Constitution that instrument, right? The instrument under which we have good government, right? There's a book called Nullification by Dr. Tom Woods, who's a good friend of mine. Tom Woods is a complete anomaly. He grew up in Massachusetts. He got his first degree from Harvard. He got several more degrees from some other Ivy League colleges, and he came out of it a screaming right-wing conservative.
Right.
He's quite an anomaly. He's written a good book called Nullification, why you can do it, how you can do it, how it has been recommended in the past, and so forth. The book's been praised by Judge Andrew Napolitano, columnist Walter Williams, Barry Goldwater Jr., the John Birch Society, and numerous others. I recommend the book very much. And you'll see it's a book of about maybe 250 pages, but only half of it is Woods, the rest of it is appendix, right? So you only got 125 pages to read. James Madison, about nullification. He said, nullification of a law can belong rightfully to a single state as one of the parties of the Constitution, the state not ceasing to avow its adherence to the rest of the Constitution. Right? So, nullification. So let's summarize. Con-con is constitutionally legitimate, but a con-con cannot be limited, and therefore it's dangerous. Wisdom has prevented creation of a con-con for the past 200 plus years. Alternatives to a con-con include forcing Congress to abide by its solemn oath and nullification of unconstitutional measures. Another comment. The late Judge Robert Bork, who was proposed for the Supreme Court and unfortunately did not pass muster with the Senate. It is my view, he said, that a federal constitutional convention could not be limited to a single issue. The original Philadelphia Convention went well beyond the purpose for which it was called, and nobody has suggested the Constitution is a nullity for that reason. Right? Good for him. So let's go back where we started. America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. Right? We certainly got to get back to that. So to whom should you listen? The John Birch Society loves the Constitution enough to want to preserve it. Con-con promoters claim to love the Constitution, but they want to change it. Right? So do you want somebody who loves it and wants to keep it, or do you want somebody who says they love it and want to change it? Well, leadership. Neoconservatives, trace them back and you'll find that neoconservatives are disciples of Leon Trotsky of the Soviet Union. They want big government, they want socialism, they're bad people. Right? A lot of them are Republicans. We have a DVD on the table back there about the neocon movement, and we really strongly recommend that you get yourself, what is it? How many hundreds of dollars does it cost?
$2 for the neocon.
$2 for the DVD. Okay. We don't want to take any of them home. $2. Right? You got rhinos, Republicans in name only, right? There's a lot of them. One fewer, however. Now Eric Cantor just got bounced. Right? Unreliable politicians. You want leadership from them? Establishment leftists. You want? No, you don't want that. Why not leadership from the John Birch Society? That's what we provide. That's what we want. Now we got the book table. You got the Constitution, a pocket version, $2. Restoring the Rights, a pamphlet that I wrote about who started to undo the Constitution way back at the beginning. You know, anybody who goes to law school knows that they praise John Marshall. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1801 to 1834, and he's the greatest, longest serving. The man did a lot of harm. Right? It's all in that booklet. The JBS, The Realities versus the Myths, right? There's a lot of myths about the Birch Society. America in the UN is another booklet that I wrote, William F. Buckley Jr. book. One of probably the greatest enemy the John Birch Society ever had, William F. Buckley. He steered millions of good-thinking Americans from even taking a look at what we had to do. Now there's another threat going on now, and it's the threat of more free trade agreements. So we have a book called International Merger under these free trade agreements, written by our CEO, Art Thompson. The JBS motto is less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Now, you can say that, and then somebody would say, well, how much less government, and where do you get this more responsibility? So let's look at it. How much less government? The amount authorized in the Constitution. If the federal government were limited only to the power granted to it by the Constitution, it would shrink 20% its size and 20% its cost. And wouldn't that be nice? Yeah. So that's how much less government we want. How about more responsibility? Where do you get that? You get that from the unamended 10 Commandments. No lying, stealing, murdering, cheating. Right? Failure to abide by a sworn oath is a serious violation of the prohibition in the 10 Commandments against giving false witness. Right? So less government and more responsibility, with God's help, would lead to a better world. Certainly lead to a better United States. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let's have
I'm sure Jack would answer any of your questions if you want to see him afterwards. Mark Affleck would like to make an announcement of what we're doing locally.